Sandra Jack, and her late mother and father were Ernest and Shirley Jack, and Ernest was from Kuwait, and Shirley was originally from Diridat, so that's where there's a lot more stories to tell about that, but we'll leave that for another time. So that's how we generally start off, how we know each other and how we introduce our special guest. Just after graduating from high school, John attended Malsapina, which is VIU now, and he earned his bachelor's degree with distinction in the field of global studies. John grew up in the News, Qualicum Beach, and Alberni. Shortly after he met and fell in love with his wife, Crystal, got married, and now they have a baby girl, 1.5 years old. I first met John in 2007 when he was appointed to the Kuwait Constitution Committee. For you that don't know, that our Constitution was a driving force behind how we function as a nation. And it was one of our most important documents, and John and myself, we were involved in that, planning that. Since then, he's involved in various capacities of the organization, right from the Treaty Enrollment, Finance Committee, Economic Development Committee, Law and Policy Development Committee, and LNG. John first was elected to Kuwait Council in 2009, and again in 2011, when the Monmouth Treaty came into effect. At that time, he was appointed as the Kuwait representative to the Alberni Clayoquot Regional District. Last December 9th, John was elected to the chair as of the ACRD, and he's now going to talk a bit about that. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce John Jack.
Well, hello everyone. So I think first off, I'd just like to stand Jeff up again and just kind of state that in our culture, Jeff doesn't identify just how important he is to our community, but he is in fact known as Yafua. He is the second hereditary chief in our Kuwait First Nations. So I just want to acknowledge that, he's a great leader in our community as well. So as stated previously, my name is John Jack, and I'm a third-term councillor with the Kuwait First Nations. Part of that, Kuwait First Nations are self-governing treaty First Nation, one of 5 First Nations part of the Monmouth Final Agreement. Now the Monmouth Final Agreement gives a measure of self-government, ownership of land, access to resources, and jurisdictions, so that we can actually make decisions for ourselves, much the same way that you can in the kind of Port Alberni Regional District context, but also we have some jurisdictions that are more approaching kind of provincial. With that out of the way, I suppose the next thing and the first thing I should have done, there's a reason why I didn't, is acknowledge that we're kind of doing our business today here on the traditional territories of the Hubichesset and the Tishak First Nations. So we share a common history with both the Hubichesset and the Tishak First Nations. Being all around the inlet and Buckley Sound, there's a lot of deep connections between those communities. And the reason why we always acknowledge, at least in Kuwait and even in the ACRD, that this is the traditional territories of those First Nations, and when we're doing business elsewhere on those First Nations, is because of the history of British Columbia more specifically. So in British Columbia, there's a lot of land that was not really dealt with during Confederation. We just kind of assumed that BC was there and it existed, but there were no agreements or treaties beyond what was happening in Victoria and close to there with the Douglas treaties. And that leaves a lot of decisions that need to be made in regards to how do you kind of reconcile the fact that BC and Canada exist where we do here today with the fact that there was a royal proclamation by, I believe, King George in 17-something that stated that First Nations who reside on their territories, without you having a treaty or not, what that really means is that it's technically still their land. And I don't say this to kind of push people away or anything like that. I say this because that's the impetus by which my First Nation started looking at what we could do to become a greater part of Confederation. One of the reasons why we and First Nations everywhere are involved in treaty negotiations and trying to put forward those solutions that we can work on together to make our lives better is that by making our lives better, we can have a positive impact on the communities around us. Not just other First Nations, but everyone in general. So we negotiated a modern treaty, and there's a lot of baggage with that word within First Nations circles, but the good thing, or the most important thing to understand is that treaties aren't about separating from Canada. From our perspective, we've been separate from the rest of Canada up until a point where we signed a treaty. So modern First Nations who have signed treaties have demonstrated a willingness to become a part of the greater Canadian society, but also move ahead together. And that's the number one message that I would like to put forward to all of you, members of the community, leaders in the community, is that there are First Nations now who are coming into a point where they're contemplating where their place is in Canada, in British Columbia, and so on and so forth. And it's a bit complicated insofar as we're not just a collection of individuals, we're a community, a nation of people who pre-existed Canada and have been recognized by the Crown and thus recognized by the Canadian Constitution. So there's a legal framework there that really has some complicating factors to just making it happen, but these are things that can be achieved over time because we've done it. And what's important to me, and I hope you can appreciate, is that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to working together with the people around us, and there are a lot of reasons to do it. There are a lot of benefits for First Nations, not just the Huu-ay-aht, but in my context, the Huu-ay-aht, to become a part of the greater community for all of our benefits. So I'm mostly trained in economics and political science from an international bent, trade, foreign relations, international agreements. It's kind of odd that I find myself in this situation, but it does inform why I think it's important that the work we do here at this level and above and above and above can have a positive impact on how things are going in the world. When First Nations work with the surrounding communities and work with the provinces and work with Canada as a whole, works with the Crown, what that allows us to do as a nation, as a country of Canada, is work together on those things that require either a lot of coordination so that we can contribute to the international community, which is something that you do every time you meet, but also compete on the open market when Canadian jobs and livelihoods are on the line. First Nations have rights. First Nations have decision-making capability that can make things harder, and you've seen that time and time again in our own history, but we can also make them easier as long as we feel and are included in what's going on. Now, most of you already know this, and I'm here to recognize that you know that, and here to recognize and appreciate the fact that the work that you do here with Rotary is concurrent and supports the kind of work that we do as First Nations and as the rest of Canada on reconciling how we're going to live together. Because that's what we're doing now, but the future is bright. It just takes continual work and continual focus. So reconciliation is important. That's one of the most important things to me, insofar as I grew up on the east coast of Vancouver Island. So I wasn't a part of my community until I started interacting with them out of university. My father is a Scots-Irishman, or he hails from Scotland, Ireland through his ancestors by way of Saskatchewan. For some reason there are a lot of Saskatchewan folks on Vancouver Island, and it's an interesting history. The only reason that I exist is because my grandfather decided to pick up and move his family away from our home territory to live in Parksville. So I'm dual cultured, I'm intercultural, I believe is the term that we use sometimes, when you're a member of both types of communities, but not wholly as a part. And that's the continual story of First Nations people across Canada, is that you have folks who live in their traditional territories, close to their communities, close to their history and culture. Then you have folks like me who didn't, and that I'm rediscovering that as time goes by. So Jeff has a traditional name, and I don't yet, but I will. And every one of those stories is a story of becoming a part of their community, but not necessarily turning away from any other. So that's another part of the message that I'm hoping to bring to the rest of everyone, is that our lives are connections of identities. We're fathers and brothers and sons and daughters and Canadians and British Columbians and Port Albernians and Rotarians. And all of those things mash together to become who you are. And that happens everywhere. And that's a good thing, because in Canada we identify and see strength in our increasing diversity. And that's the lesson of Canada. That's the benefit and that's the hope. And that's what First Nations who want to be a part of a treaty want to be a part of, is that we can be who we are and contribute to this thing called Canada at the same time. That they're not necessarily conflicting with one another, and that we're all in it together, because what we do as Canadians is often, as we think it does have a positive impact on the world as a whole, because of the fact that we can sit in a room like this together, a diverse group of people, and talk about serving humanity. And that's what gives me hope. That's why I get out of bed. Because the work that we can do locally isn't just turned inward, but rather making sure that we can contribute as a community and as a community of individuals the same way that everyone else can or has not been able to yet. So I can go on and on about that kind of thing, but just to set the stage, that's why Hawaiian went and did what they did. We did. We became a part of the greater community by signing a treaty. And we did so that we were not only in charge of our own decision-making within our community, but that we could become more interdependent and less dependent. It was never about becoming independent, per se. No country can be independent in a world like it is. And I think a lot of the nationalist governments that are going to be coming into power are going to learn that. We all lean on one another for everyone's mutual benefit, whether or not you're thinking about it in that way. And that's the lesson that I see this group bringing, that you're working together interdependently so that you can do something greater. And Kuwait wants to be a part of that, but we have to do work in such a way that we can kind of have that extra time or resources to contribute in a good way, and provide those opportunities for our people so that they can have that extra time and opportunity to make the world better in the way that they see fit. And that's why we're involved. That's why we create connections, and we want to be involved in any way that we can, with some constraints, given time. So I guess the only thing I'll leave off with is our experience with the regional district has been one that's been very informative of how I see things, how they can happen in the future. So the story of our joining the CRD is somewhat interesting. So at the time, we had become a self-governing First Nation in 2011, April 1st, 2011. And that was amazing, cathartic, terrifying, because we had all of these things that we had to do to make sure that we had it all covered ourselves. We can no longer blame the federal government for our ills. We were in charge of that. And all of the responsibility and amazingness and intimidation that comes with that. One of the things that we were able to do is join the regional district in a meaningful way. And so when I say that, that means a full voting member of the regional district in a way that's never been done before. There have been First Nations representatives of electoral areas or of cities, but no single First Nations representative representing just that First Nation, with the exception of Swasin, who got there about 3 months before us. But that whole doing of it has been how I see reconciliation working. Because we gave notice in January of we wanted to join, and as soon as possible. We gave notice in 2011, and we were hoping to join as soon as possible. The ACRD was completely flabbergasted by this, because the ACRD local governments aren't really involved in the negotiation of treaties. So the provincial government went, yeah, that's fine, you can join the regional district, without really talking to the regional district about what to expect. The good thing is that when we provided our notice to the province and the regional district that we intended to join, the reaction wasn't poor. The reaction was actually a bit of surprise in regards of, wow, okay. And then getting down to what that actually meant. So at the time, the chair of the ACRD was the late Len Wong, who showed a lot of good, honest leadership in saying that we want you to join us, we're excited for it, but we're also intimidated by it. We have no, it's like we were pushed into a room together and said to get along, never having met each other. And I think actually that kind of blank slate was the best opportunity for two communities to come together. There's no baggage there, or there isn't necessarily like there is with the province or the federal government. So after some discussions with our council and me with Jeff, we agreed that we would hold off on joining the ACRD until April of 2012. We would sit as observers and kind of learn their ways, and then we would work together with the ACRD on creating a document that would explain who we were to the rest of the ACRD, and the ACRD would explain who and how they worked, who they were and how they worked. And then we joined officially in April of 2012, and I've been the Hooyat's official representative to the board since then. Recently, it came to my attention that the mayor of Tofino, Josie Osborne, who's a great person, no longer could continue on as the chair of the ACRD because she had a lot of things she wanted to do with her community. So I decided to put my name forward, and lo and behold, I was successful. And so here I am as not only a councillor of the Hooyat First Nations and a representative for them at the ACRD, but I'm also the chair of the ACRD. And that is a very good indicator of just how much progress there's been in this regional district with those directors and the people who elected them and the administration who's been amazing in helping us along the way. That's a story we need to tell across the province and perhaps across the country, because if we do that integration correctly, not even correctly, in a meaningful way, even if we make mistakes, in an honest way, there are so many benefits there. And we now have the impetus to have those conversations in a way that maybe we haven't had them before, so that we can all move ahead in a good way, because reconciliation isn't just about addressing grievances, it's about how we can move forward together and address the issues that affect us across the entire region. And that's at once amazing and hopeful and terrifying. And I hope to see you along the way as we do it. So, thank you.
Do you have any questions, John? Anybody, any questions?
Sure thing.
John, I remember working with Chief Les Sam here a number of years ago, and it was I think it was Canada's 142nd birthday. So I was out talking to him about it, and he says, "Ken, you got to be kidding me. Do you want us to get involved in Canada's 142nd birthday? Yet, you know, you don't recognize that we've been here for 5,000 years." And I learned a great lesson that day, that how neat it would have been if we could be saying that, hey, Canada is actually 5,000 years old as opposed to 142 years old. So I learned a great lesson that day.
And it's an important thing to note, is that the history of this area goes back at least that far. And while we may not have specific stories about this and that existence, that living in this area does create a heritage and an understanding of the land that we should share with the rest of Canada, but also the rest of the world. There are a lot of things that we can work together on in terms of creating the story of the Alberni Valley and the story of the Banfield-Pachena Bay area and the story of further northwest, that can teach a lot about how we can work together and how we may move into the future in a more sustainable way as well. There are a lot of lessons that we can teach each other, and I know for sure that our nation learned a lot by just interacting with the ACRD, seeing how they did things in a professional and focused way, and how they went about governing. We've learned so much just doing that. But I think our claim to fame is that we helped the ACRD go paperless. We actually got rid of paper, and then they followed suit. So that's part of it. Any other questions?
Well, John, on behalf of the Rotary Club, I'd like to thank you very much for your presentation. You've had a very captive audience. I just looked around, and I noticed Cherie, she had a smile constantly on her face as you were speaking. So anyway, it was well presented. Just a note, a friend of mine is deceased, George Watts, was very instrumental in bringing a lot of the bands together and everything else.
Yeah.
And I think you'd be a definite positive for the regional district.
Yeah.
And I wish you all the best on behalf of the Rotary Club.
Thank you.